Hello, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. We still have people coming in fast and furious, but we have a short time, so we're not going to delay. Welcome, I am Daniela Bleichmar. I am the director of the USC Levan Institute for the Humanities and the USC Society of Fellows. And this event is a collaboration between the two. It is part of the Levan Institute's How To series, which are workshops where we discuss how humanists do the things we do. And we are truly delighted today to have three wonderful and very experienced editors to talk with us about how to publish your first book. We are going to have brief comments from all three of our invited speakers, and then we are going to have questions from the participants. Given the large number of attendants today, I am going to, when we open it up to the Q&A, I'm going to ask people to type in their questions in the chat, and I will moderate and try to bring together, to synthesize some of the questions so we get as many as possible. Our three speakers today will speak in alphabetical order, and I am truly delighted that they have joined us. We have with us Elizabeth Ault, who is an editor at Duke University Press, Eric Crahan, who is editorial director for the Humanities and Social Sciences at Princeton University Press, and Karen Darling, who is executive editor and editor for science studies at the University of Chicago Press. So Elizabeth, let us start hearing from you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction, Daniela, for setting up this event and for agreeing to moderate the questions. That's no small task. Thanks to everyone for joining us for this event at the end of another tumultuous week. And I hope everyone is feeling a little better to have made it to this Friday. We've decided to split our discussion this morning into a roughly chronological outline of the process. So I'll start by discussing how to choose a publisher, how to approach editors. Eric will outline the book proposal itself, and Karen will talk through what happens after you submit the proposal. So I'm sure Eric will cover this in thinking about book proposals, but before you start thinking seriously about publishers, you need to figure out what your book is. I mean, that sounds very basic, and yet it's very complicated. You also need to figure out, how is it different from your dissertation? What are the key arguments of your book? How are you going to structure the book to invite readers in, letting them know the payoff right up front rather than waiting to the end, presenting information and theory in ways that can easily be used and taken up by others? Reading other people's first books for structure and argument in addition to content is a great way to do this. Reimagining your book as something you're writing for an audience that isn't your dissertation committee is also a crucial task. Who are the key audiences for your work? What do they need to get out of your book? Work on developing a shorthand way to discuss your project that doesn't just tell a reader what it is about, say, garbage workers in Senegal, but what does it do? For example, change conversations about infrastructure to include labor and spirituality. This isn't work that you can do solo, so you also need to figure out who your networks are. Who are your writing buddies? Who are your cheerleaders? Who are the people who might give you feedback you don't want to hear? Who are the mentors that you can discuss thorny questions with? Test your arguments out on them. Think about how you're part of the community of thought and conversation. And then as you work on revising your manuscript and developing your proposal, think about which presses are most active in publishing work by and for this community. When I say active, I mean which presses are publishing the books that people are talking about now. It's awful to get a proposal that maybe references only books that Duke published in the 90s, or is suggesting a submission for a series that hasn't published any new books in the last 10 years. Presses obviously make information about their current books available in a plethora of ways. Catalogs are up on websites, so you can check out the newest and forthcoming books to get a sense of the current direction of a press's list. All of us editors have bios on our press websites that indicate our current areas of interest, our recent title acquisitions. We might indicate that a press is making a foray into a new field, in which case an editor might be particularly excited to meet with junior scholars working to reshape conversations. I strongly recommend reading book acknowledgements on books.google.com. That's an easy way to find out who worked with a particular author or edited a particular book. You can also chat with your friends and mentors about this. Is there an exciting new series happening in your field? Where are your colleagues publishing? Does your department have particular expectations about the kind of press you'll publish with? And is there a possibility that you might respectfully leverage some of these relationships into an endorsement of your work or an introduction? Of course, this is not necessary to forge a relationship with the press, but it certainly never hurts. I like to think of the work of being an acquisition editor as having a number of different parts. And most relevant for this small piece that I'm talking about here is sort of being like a talent scout or an A&R rep at a record label. We're always eager to hear about exciting scholarship. Big conferences are one of our most important ways to get a sense of the field. Who's talking to whom? What are the big exciting questions? What books is everyone reading? We're still in these COVID times without as much access to this sort of conference buzz. We're still reading conference programs. We're still keeping up with journals. We're still reaching out to scholars based on those and based on conversations with our authors and peer reviewers about colleagues, students, work they admire. But in the time of COVID, it's really a changing time for this question about how to approach an editor and how to choose a publisher. We may have more opportunities to attend panels and to, you could be at a different Zoom event pretty much every hour of every day, taking in so much knowledge. It's a little overwhelming. But what we have actually are fewer opportunities to really develop relationships, to talk to scholars one-on-one. And I know that I and my colleagues here at Duke have talked a lot about how hungry we are for those conversations. So in some regards, there's actually never been a better time to approach an editor to set up the kind of half-an-hour meeting, a virtual coffee that you might have previously had in a hotel lobby. I know personally, I actually enjoy having these meetings spread out, maybe 1 or 2 a week here in my office, as opposed to trying to talk to 40 people over one very long weekend, shuttling from the exhibit hall to the bar, to the lobby, etc. I also want to point out that editors too are still reaching out to people. And even if you feel like you're not ready, it's always worth talking to an editor if they take the initiative to reach out to you. And hopefully this workshop and others like it will give you a sense of what questions to ask and what an editor might want to know about your work. And I emphasize that because, you may never feel ready. You may never feel like, oh, I know what my book is about and I have 100% confidence and we're doing this. I think it sounds scary. Obviously, publishing is very high stakes. But please know that we need to talk to y'all just as much as you need to talk to us. Talking to scholars about their work is one of the most energizing and exciting parts of our jobs. Our email addresses are available on press websites for a reason. If you reach out to an editor and they're not able to meet, or if they think it's sort of not the right time, they'll let you know, and usually in a judgment-free way. I know it can be harder. There are definitely people who maybe aren't socialized into a sense of entitlement or a feeling that their work is inherently worth of other people's time. And so I particularly encourage scholars of color and women to not be shy about reaching out. If an editor is willing to set up a meeting, they'll probably want to see some example of your work prior to chatting. Sometimes just a paragraph abstract might be enough to ground a conversation. Other times they might want to read a proposal or even see more material before being able to commit. There isn't necessarily one right time to reach out, but you should always be honest about where you are in the process so the editor can tailor their advice to that phase of developing the project, working through the arguments, and having a sense of whether the project is a good fit for our press. The idea of fit comes up a lot, and I'm sure that's something that we'll be talking about that Karen and Eric will mention as well. And I want to point out that the question of fit is not only about whether the book is a fit for the press, but whether an editor is a fit for a project. That's also why it's fine to email several editors to have many exploratory conversations, as I'm sure my colleagues will be talking about here shortly. The first book can be a long haul process. So is this a person that you have a good rapport with, that you can be honest with, that you can work with over time? Do you like talking to them and working with them? Do you trust them to understand your work and find the right peer reviewers? Are they going to be a good advocate for the book, both within their press and then out in the world? And sometimes when you have these preliminary conversations, you end up developing a really great rapport with someone, and then it's a very clear path. Like, I'm going to submit my proposal and my manuscript to this one person. That's often not the case. And so assuming that you haven't been in deep conversation with an editor by the time your book proposal is really ready to shop around, it's totally fine to send that out widely to applicable presses. And I'm going to now hand it over to Eric to talk a little bit more about what that proposal can look like and what it should do. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks to Danielle and everyone at the USC Levant Institute for the Humanities for the invitation today. It's really good to see everybody. So a proposal, you've now looked through the landscape, you've talked to lots of editors, and pretty much every one of them asked at one point, so do you have a proposal? There's a really reason for this. The proposal, in a sense, is the first formal step in a conversation between an author and a publisher. It's the way that we can get, start to get across the bridge from the great idea and the great conversation we had at a booth to the book down the line. It's sort of where the rubber meets the road. There's a lot of bad metaphors to describe proposals. It's an invitation, it's a seduction, it's a pitch. These are all true to some extent, but again, it's that first step, that first formal communication in connecting you to a possible publisher. I think one other thing about a proposal that's really important to know is that, especially for your first book, there's an element of it being as aspirational. Think of it in terms of your own dissertation proposal when you first sort of projected what you imagined your project would be. You probably hadn't got to the archives or you hadn't read all the books you want, but you kind of knew what you thought you wanted to do. And of course, it changed after that. And book proposals have a very similar life. So you have to think of it both as an aspiration of the book that you want to write, but also the start of a conversation. And every publisher is going to have their own ways through this conversation. So one other important point I want to make about publishers is that, or proposals, is you need to know who the audience is. I think that when you're thinking, to be aware of who is going to read it. So in the first case, of course, it's the editor who you approached or is on the website or you submitted to. But it's also going to be read by every other single person if the editor is interested in that publishing house. It could be read by members of the production department of marketing and publicity, other editors, sales reps. It also will be potentially read by outside advisors for academic presses. We want to say like, oh, this is an interesting proposal. Is this of interest? So you need to tailor your proposal in a way that it's accessible enough to non-specialist readers in publishing houses, but also its merits will come through to specialist readers who will know the fields really, really well. It's a really tricky line to walk, but it is important to think about. If you're too much in the scholarly weeds, you lose part of the publishing house. If you're too general, you lose some of the scholarly interest. So you need to really think about it this way. Proposals, the harmony's the same. If you go through every website of agencies or university presses, almost always have the same exact elements. And I'll go through, and there's a reason, because they all serve a purpose. And I'll go through each of those elements briefly, and their import. So the first part is really the overview of your work. This needs to be the big idea. It needs to, I've heard it described as the Seder question. How is your book going to be different from all other books? What is covered? What is the range of your argument? What's your primary research? What's its contribution? How is it distinctive? In a few pages, you need to be able to convey these elements of the book and to be able to really give a big contour of the argument. The second part of almost every proposal is the chapter outline. This needs to be an annotated chapter outline. It needs to give a sense of the structure of the book. I would say this needs to have equal weight as the overview. I think a lot of people tend to really focus on the overview and they forget the importance of the chapter outline from their structure. Each chapter needs to have an argument, and each argument needs to connect to the general argument of the book so that the whole becomes greater than the parts. For a lot of scholarly work, especially emerging from dissertations, this is actually one of the biggest transformations from dissertation to book, to really get to that idea of what's an argument sustained across multiple chapters to make a much broader set of claims. The third piece of information that's important is the information about you, the author. Why did you write this book? Why are you qualified to write it? Who do you know? Are you the best person to write it? What were your reasons for writing it? It's not just a bio, but it's also, in a way, think of it both as a sense of your qualifications and expertise, but also as a way to explain how you will be a partner in promoting the book down the line. I think so many people think of when they're engaging with a publisher for the first time, they're thinking of how can I get attention? How can I be accepted? And they forget what some of the publishers are thinking of is this exciting and how am I going to publish it? So when you're talking about yourself, that's another really important part of the proposal. The fourth is the market. Who's going to read your book? Who do you think is going to read it? On what basis and why? Will it be assigned in courses? Is it for a subfield? Is it for a range of specialists? How do you know? It's important for you to have a clear view of who you think your audience is. And I do want to also point out that publishers treat this with a great deal of skepticism. Authors aren't always clear who their audiences are. But at the same time, we want to hear who you think the audiences are. Is it for, like I said, is it for your field? It's probably, as if it emerges from, yeah, exactly, Elizabeth, not the general educated reader. These people do not exist. And your book cannot be for, specialists of early modern Europe, students and the general reader. Books very rarely cross these kinds of borders. So you really want to think carefully about who you imagine the audience is for your book, because it needs to match up to your overview and your chapters. If it's thinking of something like philosophical, if it's a highly technical book, it's probably not going to reach general readers or even maybe outside of a subfield. So you want to think carefully about that, and that it lines up with the other elements of your proposal. Fifth is competition. I said up front, how is your book different from other books? And I think there's a real tendency to say my book is unique. Your book is not unique. Your book speaks into a conversation that started from a whole bunch of, whether it's in the field you're in, whether it's the range of other scholars who've worked on the topic, whether it comes out of the archive or the materials. And so in some ways you need to tell us what conversation you're in. What are the other books, maybe at my publishing house or others, that your book speaks to? What are the scholarly conversations that it informs? This is helpful for us to think about in terms of how would we, again, back to that issue of how are we publishing it? Who would we need to reach? What are the other books that it looks like? You want to think broadly about the secondary literature, and you want it to be it's not a historiographical essay. It is not a literature review. It needs to be a sort of an assessment of the current market and and the other books in your area. Then the last part of every proposal is what I call the complicating factors, the details. How long is it going to be? How many pictures and tables does it have? How much is written? When do you think you'll be finished with it? Have you submitted it to another publisher? Is there a timetable that you need to meet? Timing is especially important for first books. I know that everyone has professional clocks. So, can't you be explicit up front with the publisher, because this helps us understand your constraints. These kind of details are incredibly important, and it sort of establishes a line. We want to know the big idea, but we also want to know the mechanics. And so having these up front is important. The proposal doesn't always go alone, but you should restrain yourself from wanting to submit the full manuscript. You should never submit a draft of a full manuscript unless you're invited by a publisher to do so. But you can send along with your proposal a writing sample. A chapter is perfectly good. I encourage you not to submit an introduction of your work alongside your proposal because it has so many elements that overlap. I would suggest a substantive chapter. Give me a sense of your exposition, how you're using evidence, your argument. Or if you've published a related article, having a sample of if a published work is really helpful as well, even though I would caution that a book and a journal article have very different audiences, and you want to be mindful of that. I'd love a copy of your CV, because this gives me a sense of your intellectual trajectory and training. It is helpful for us to understand these things, even though that's not a fully delimiting factor. So I'll end up before passing to Karen, just to sort of a few, and she's going to talk about the next steps in terms of consideration and what we do with the proposal when we get it. But just some quick common mistakes you should not make. Your proposal should not be addressed to an editor in another press when I receive it. It should not have typos. You should not get in the weeds and assume too much that I know too much. I'm not always sure. There's sometimes get a sense of that, like, as you know this book and as you know this book. It needs assume that I have little information or I'm being introduced to the first time. And I encourage you to think about it the same way you would use an application to a job, which is customize your proposal. The same proposal to every publisher doesn't make sense. In each publisher, as you can look at our websites, we all have different things we're looking for. We have different ways of working, different publishing goals. We're publishing different books. And so it shows that you've researched your website, you've looked at what we're doing, and you have a sense of how your potential book would fit with our program. So anyways, with that note, the proposal's now landed in Karen's inbox.
Thank you. No, and I'm very happy to see it. I'm going to follow up right with what happens once it is in an editor's inbox. And I think we can think of this part a little bit as what to expect when you're expecting a decision and what is a decision anyway. And so to keep the remarks brief, and because there are differences among presses on how we handle our review of a proposal, I'm going to discuss the first stage of the process, which is the acquiring editor's initial evaluation. This is probably the first thing to mention. There is an initial evaluation. Book proposals aren't automatically sent to peer reviewers. The editor is first going to make on their own or in consultation with series editors, perhaps, a decision about what to do with this. Should it basically be declined, or should it undergo some next steps? So I'm going to talk about what we think about when we're making this first decision. So basically what we're asking is, does the proposed book merit further consideration by the press, or is it best to decline it, to publish it without further review? So when we looked at how you chose a publisher and what's in a book proposal, we were, as Eric sort of made very explicit, looking at the purpose of the book proposal. And so the purpose is, put simply, to provide the acquiring editors what they need to evaluate the press's ability to publish the book. And there are two aspects of this, that all of those elements of the proposal and all of the reasons why you chose to send it to a particular editor fit into. And those two aspects are editorial considerations, such as discussions of the content of the book and the list that it's trying to be a part of. And on the other hand, marketing or sales considerations. So I'll begin by saying that above all, we're looking for quality work. So this is sort of the floor. We need to publish books that have substantial scholarly merit. It must be accurate, responsible, true, worthwhile. The author must be able to communicate their ideas, and so on. So this is sort of basic. And believe me, probably not among this audience, but we do get proposals that just don't at all meet this standard. But the next step, and this is, I think, what's harder to hear, not every work of merit is publishable by a press like the ones we're representing. There are other ways to publish. There are other kinds of publishers. There's self-publishing. There's publishing in formats other than a book. But we're focusing here on talking about publishing a first book with a scholarly press. So in other words, although we're looking first for the scholarly value alone isn't enough justification for our continuing the review and ultimately publishing a book. I'm just going to throw out some initial figures to try to drive this home, because I think it's important to try to understand, you know, the why we're approaching your work the way we do. So costs, just sort of very rough estimates, maybe $30,000 to make a book, including the overhead, 10 to 12,000 for manufacturing costs alone, for standard printing, 3,000 for typesetting alone, 85 to 150 manuscript editing hours, ebook costs, you know, in addition to, in addition to the costs that I've described in, you know, creating the book. While there aren't warehousing or printing costs, there's also, you know, IT and associated other costs. So ebooks aren't free. I just want to toss that out there. So the publication of any book, even an electronic only book, is an investment by the publisher, and it needs to reach enough readers to support that investment. So that's basically what we're looking for. Can we publish your book in a sustainable way? Can we be financially responsible for publishing your book? And you know, another way to say this is that books need to have commercial potential. So the book's topic is important in this regard, but there are other aspects that the editor has to consider. And these are some of the things that we're asking you to bring out in your proposal. You know, like Eric said, the author's platform, for example, is increasingly important because, you know, in looking to sell the book, we're looking for your involvement in helping us to do this, helping us to reach as many people as possible, and you're key to that. So there's the platform, but there's also the quality of the writing. And so when we're looking at it, we're trying to figure out if the book would be successful. And so from our view, the successful book is a project that has a committed readership, that's written and organized to appeal to that audience and contained within production limits that could be financially feasible. So I hope it's starting to come together why we're asking you for those details that Eric said at the end about the length of your book, how, whether it needs color illustrations, what the timeline would be. All of these are helping us to figure out if we can, for a book whose content interests us, whose quality seems, you know, solid, whether or not we can go further and evaluate it on, you know, on its scholarly merits. Are we comfortable with the financial sort of picture that we can paint of this project? And that's why, you know, your understanding of who you're writing for and how the way you're writing your book is going to help reach that audience is so important. So another way to put this is that what makes the book financially viable is its ability to reach sufficient buyers. So we want to know that what you say you're going to do is going to meet that audience. And we'll have ideas of who that audience could be, and we'll listen to your ideas. So I think it's really important what Eric also said at the beginning is that this is the beginning of a conversation. So while there is, and I'm emphasizing, you know, a significant, you know, weight placed on the proposal because it's helping us to see whether we would be appropriate people to continue to evaluate your work. We can help you make a better proposal if we think in our initial reading of it that it's likely to be viable for us to publish. Let's see. Some practical things. This could take us a couple weeks. So I think that it's safe to say that you can write to an editor maybe 2 weeks after you've submitted to say, hey, you know, I sent you something a couple weeks ago. I haven't heard from you, you know, that sort of thing. but do try to give us a little bit of time, because we are taking everything seriously and trying to, make these decisions on it. So then what is the decision? The decision is either it's not a fit for us and we might recommend other places where it might fit better. Or we can discuss next steps, and that's next steps in terms of revising the proposal, talking about how we might see the work developing. Is that how you might see it develop? Or say, I think it would be stronger if you, included a writing sample from this piece of the work, or, when is this other part going to be ready that we can share with someone? So it begins the discussion. And then following that, it would be peer review, and or it could be an invitation to submit the complete manuscript when it's ready. And so those steps go into more details of how each press works. So I won't cover them here in this overview, but I just wanted to say that I hope that this gives you some reasoning behind the proposal and behind the selection of the presses to approach, so that you can see that what we're looking for is something that's in line with what we've done before, but yet new enough and interesting enough that we think we can make something of it if we put our resources to it, and that we can help shape and bring out the best in the work that you have. And that usually comes from our experience with similar work, both in our editorial involvement, but also in our marketing and sales involvement. So that's why we're looking for books that are similar to what we've done, but of course not the same. Yeah, so I think this is, in terms of the overall process of what we're talking about today, this is the first step in how to publish your first book.
Thank you so much, Karen, Eric, and Elizabeth. That was so concise and full of information. And I also hope that it transmits to everybody here that the editor is not Saint Peter with the keys to heaven, or the executioner who's going to decide whether you live or die. Is a person who loves books and loves scholarship as much as you do, and who is out there looking for books and helping authors find their publishers. So we're all on the same side, is how I would put it. There's a lot of questions already filing in, and I'm going to maybe start with some that are very quick and can be answered quickly before we get into more detailed ones. One question was, do you all as editors need somebody to be affiliated with a university to be considered as an author, or do you consider proposals from independent scholars? Given what the job market is, somebody may not be employed permanently by a university at the time they submit their proposal.
I can just answer that quickly. I think I completely am very understanding of the nightmare disaster that is the job market, and the way that people are being put into contingent positions that end up starting maybe as temporary and continuing for a long time. I think part of the consideration there is just what someone's time is and what their access to resources are to actually work on their book. So that would be a concern. An additional concern could potentially be, what is this person's platform? So if they're an independent scholar, are they still attending conferences? Are they still kind of plugged into intellectual networks and conversations? And it could very well be the case that that's so. For example, we've published lots of books of poetry by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, a poet who has a PhD from Duke, but does not have a formal tenure track teaching job. So I think there's certainly arrangements where we're open to thinking about this work, and certainly things that I'm personally trying to innovate with people to address this issue, because there are so many brilliant books out there that are going unwritten because of the labor situation. But on the other hand, I think Karen did a really good job of kind of sketching out the factors that we're trying to take into account as part of the bigger picture, and how to connect a book by an independent scholar with an audience. that may have less access to that scholar and to their work. So, but it's not an automatically disqualifying factor by any stretch of the imagination. No.
Would it be fair to say that it's not about credentials, but about making sure that the book does the kind of work that your press needs a book to do? Yeah, is that a good
That's
way
a nice
to
way
put
to put it, Daniela.
Thank you. Several people have asked how much of the book manuscript should they have ready before they send a proposal? Do they send it soon when they're just starting, or should they wait until they have the entire book? When do they reach out to you?
I think if you have at least a couple chapters, 1 or 2 at least, maybe 3, we want to be able to see what the writing looks like for the book. So the dissertation writing is one voice and style, but usually the book has different ambitions. And so if you have at least 1, but preferably 2 of the substantive pieces written in the voice and fitting within the description of chapters that you've provided so that we can see how you're executing the plan, that would be good.
Thank you. And I will put it from the other side, you know, for the press, they want to see that you have enough for yourself. If you have a tenure clock, I would work backward from that. And so if you know that you need to have the book published by year 5 or 4, you need to be, and production takes at least a year, and you need to first do revisions. You want to start reaching out to the editor early enough that you have time to go through the entire process. So keeping the entire timeline in mind is for the author in your best interest. One question is, how long should proposals be? Is longer better? Is shorter better? What's a range?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I'm happy to step in on this. Yeah. This is not as long as people think. People sometimes expect that they need to be, you know, sort of, you know, chapter length or you know, or much longer. But really, if you can cover this material in 10 pages, 20 pages, that absolutely will suffice. You know, 3 or 4 pages might be a little slight, but even then, sometimes we've you know, if it covers the material well, that might be enough to start the next conversation. So, but I think if you start to get into, you know, for some, you know, for literary works where there's more substantial writing samples, sometimes you can get 50 or 60 or 100-page proposals. For nonfiction and for you know, books emerging from revised dissertations, that long is not really necessary.
Thank you. There was a question about the etiquette of submitting proposals to multiple presses, which I know one of you mentioned early on is okay, but how to handle that?
I'm sure we'll all have slightly different views on this, but maybe we could. The way that I think about it is, first of all, when you're writing your proposal and you're researching, publishers, you know, if you're sending your proposal out to 10 or 15 publishers, maybe you're casting your net too wide and you're not being precise enough. And then on the other hand, if you're only sending a 1 or 2, maybe you're not having enough conversations. But when you're talking to editors, it is, you know, I guess the issue is really candor. If you've told me you've sent it to 10 or 15 other publishers, I would worry or wonder about potentially how serious you are about my publishing program or the potential fit there. And then just down the line, as you're proceeding through when as a publisher, if I'm deciding to invest resources, meaning if I've decided to, okay, let's go forward to peer review and let's send it out, I become a little bit more stringent. We're happy to compete. You know, especially if you know, their books are really attractive and really is a great fit for us. But largely what we're looking for at that point is, you know, listen, if we're coming to this stage, you know, and I'm really interested in a book, I hope to be, you know, one of no more than a handful of people who are participating. But I think the key issue is really to be candid about it. Because and also let's think about it in kind of even slightly more market terms, which is, you know, your dissertation probably emerges out of a specialty of a subfield. Like, how many true experts are there in any subfield? There's actually like a real sort of you know, if chances are you could come up, you know, you and I could come up with the same 5 list of ideal readers for most subfields because of the nature of the work. And so sending it out to too many people sometimes can be, can work against you, because basically you're bumping against the same readers and the same reviewers on the other side.
I'm wondering if Karen or Elizabeth have something substantially different or that they want to add.
No, I would agree. I guess I would just maybe sound another note of caution. It's definitely important before any outside review is taken to make your position clear on how many others remain in the running for your project. But I would strongly encourage you to figure out who would be your top or your top 2 choices, and a letter that says, you know, you are my top choice will get more attention from that top choice than one that says I've submitted to 5 places, because we have to be very careful on the resources, even our own personal time resources that we invest in a project. And if I know that I'm your top choice and you haven't submitted it elsewhere, I can give it better attention than if I have to make a decision because I get so many, you know, in a day that, well, if, you know, if 5 other places are considering this, my time is short, and I just might say, okay, good luck. And it could just be a matter of time. So if you know that you have a top choice, I would say make that clear, because it is, you know, as Eric said, very difficult to find readers these days. You know, I mean, it's probably always been, but it is especially now with people having more difficulty working from home, or in all of these, you know, situations we find ourselves to line up readers, that we just can't overburden this system, which is really done on the edges of people's professional responsibilities, unfortunately.
I wonder if it might make sense to discuss the difference between a preliminary contract and an early conversation with the press and an actual publication contract where there is a, you know, monogamous commitment between the press and the author. Elizabeth, we haven't heard from you for a while. Do you want to take this?
I have a terrible answer to this question because Duke Press does not issue advance contracts.
Okay.
We have one kind of contract. We also have a slightly longer peer review process because our board doesn't weigh in on contracts. They weigh in at the very end of the process to give us the final approval to publish the book. So I would defer to someone who works at a press that issues them, who would know more about how they work.
Thank you. So Karen or Eric? Eric, you unmuted yourself.
Oh, I didn't realize. I'm happy to get, like, yeah, I'm happy to answer this too. This is, so, I mean, from my perspective, that there is no difference between an advance and a standard contract. An advance contract is a commitment to publish, but it has a condition. The condition is that it suitably passes, that it passes peer review and is accepted by the editorial board. But from the position of the press, if we offer an advance contract, it is fully with the full intention to publish the work, and so there's not any difference from that perspective.
I agree that the difference is that it's actually the same document. It's just that at the later stage, once our faculty board has approved the book for publication, that same piece of paper becomes a final contract. But we take our advance contracts as serious commitments, and we'll go to great lengths to try to publish and wait decades, I have in some cases, to publish the books that we intended to publish.
Thank you. One question is, how many book proposals do you receive per year, and how many books do you publish from these proposals? What are the odds?
I can speak a little bit about that, and I think that's why I was really happy to alphabetically be assigned the talking with editors piece, because of things that just come in over the transom, you know, hundreds come in a year, several a week. I would say the number, I think we ran the numbers a couple of years ago, and maybe we publish 5% of things that just come in unsolicited. The numbers of things we publish that just come in are very low. And that's why I think it's very important to work on developing relationships with editors and really kind of focusing, thinking about where your book has the best home, as Karen and Eric have been speaking to, prior to submitting materials, right? Because if I've been meeting with someone at a conference, like every American Studies, I have a coffee with this person, or, you know, I published their advisor's book and then we like had a, whatever. Like if I've been talking to the same person and working with them to develop their ideas over a long period of time, when that proposal comes in, when I finally get to see those chapters, like I'm much more invested in that project's success. You know, I'm much more likely to give a person feedback if we've been kind of talking for a long time. That also makes it tricky to submit to multiple places, I would say. So it is a delicate balance. If I've been working, you know, talking with someone for a number of years and giving them substantive feedback, it's painful actually for them to then say, oh, and by the way, I'm also sending this to NYU and Minnesota. And that it's like not a great feeling. So I think because the odds are so low in terms of things coming in over the transom, that is why I put so much weight and emphasis on sort of trying to build a relationship and see if a project is feasible before, you know, getting too invested in the particular idea of publishing with one specific press.
Thank you. Given the importance of that relationship from early on with the editor, there's a couple of questions about how to approach an editor, what kinds, you know, whether it's at a conference. Somebody said, could you please give us an example of how somebody should approach you and talk to you? Or as Elizabeth mentioned, if these days it's online, I think it can feel very intimidating, or that the project may not be ready, or that the person may, if the conversation doesn't go well, the stakes are so high. So can you give people just sort of a sense of how you like to be approached and what a successful conversation would look like on your end?
I like to see something like an abstract. So just a note that says, you know, I'm working in this area. You know, I see that, you know, Chicago has published these books recently that, you know, are in line with what I'm doing. Here's a description of my work. Does this sound like something that might interest you? Could we talk about it? Something like that, I think is good, because it helps to have more than just a line about what you're doing, because those can be too general. So if you have a page description of what you're really arguing, that's helpful. It also gives us more to, you know, dig into about crafting it into a book.
Absolutely, and give some sense of where you are in the process. You know, did you just defend last month? Have you had a book manuscript workshop? Like all of these questions. I would say personally, for most of the editors I know, we don't love to be approached like at a conference. I think like just in terms of having a casual conversation, introducing yourself, that's totally fine. But I would say I wouldn't necessarily expect that you could come up to an editor at a major conference and be able to get 20 to 30 minutes of their time. I know for me at conferences, I'm usually scheduled like back to back to back to back. Other editors do like to hang out in the booth and have conversations there. And so that's, you know, there is a little bit of a crapshoot element there. When conferences resume again, I think the sweet spot in terms of emailing someone to set up a meeting at a conference is usually maybe 2 to 3 weeks ahead of time, because they're starting to make their schedule, but maybe they haven't locked everything in yet. Whereas if you're emailing someone the week before the conference, while the conference is actually happening, it's very unlikely that they might have enough flexibility in their schedule to fit a different meeting in. And if you're emailing folks too far in advance, it might be kind of like, oh, I am still thinking about African studies. I haven't even started to think about sociology, or that's a bad temporal example, but anyway. So yeah, I think kind of emailing someone in that kind of month-ish to 2 weeks ahead of the conference is usually good. I think the material that Karen mentioned is really perfect. In terms of how a meeting will go, I don't necessarily, and I think Eric mentioned this in the proposal, I don't necessarily need someone to like get deep in the weeds of like, here are the archives that I visited. Here's a detailed story about like Iranian history and the key actors in this social movement. It's like giving some of the big picture questions, thinking through those ideas about how does this fit with what my press has published, or what books that we've published are you kind of thinking with or speaking back to? How does your work fit into the life of the conference? Like, what have you seen at the conference that's been like, oh, this field really does need this book, and here's why. So those are the sorts of things I would anticipate talking with someone about at a first meeting at a conference. Subsequent meetings might be able to get more into those details, more into like sort of process questions. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you. There's so many questions, it's sort of impossible. There's quite a few questions about manuscript workshops, which have become so much more common. And Elizabeth, I know you answered one of them on the chat, which is if your university holds a book manuscript workshop where you get feedback from scholars, can those scholars serve as peer reviewers? Which for Elizabeth's case was yes, but I've also heard from other presses that it may not work that way. So I wanted to ask Karen and Eric if they might answer that. And attached to that was a question about whether there's some way to sort of connect the workshop to the peer review process, or if they're entirely separate.
I think it can work multiple ways, and it depends on the situation, and usually time constraints, either for an author or a publication schedule, might help determine what approach we take. So I think for us, technically, there's no reason why someone couldn't serve both functions as a participant and as a peer reviewer. I prefer not to do it because I would prefer to give the author feedback that they haven't already received. You know, I want our review to be useful to the author, you know, and I guess in terms of timing, I've had it work where it's at the same time. So when that's going on, we also send it to peer review, but I've also done it sequentially where they may have the workshop revised from the workshop, and then that manuscript, which is presumably more polished, that we send to review, which you know, theoretically would hopefully lead to a quicker review and revision process after that. So I think either of those two scenarios work, and you know, either of the two options for do they serve or don't they serve work. But it depends on your individual needs and case.
So maybe one thing would be to just have the conversation early on with your desired press. My university does this. Mm-hmm. How do we, you know, make sure that they don't conflict?
Yeah, and I've participated in some, and if you are able to invite your editor, you know, it's useful for them to see how people are reacting to the book, because then we can help advise on these changes that might be made to make it, you know, more tuned to your audience.
There's so many good questions. I will, there's several around the author's social media strategy and platform, and how important it is for that. How much do you consider that when considering a book proposal?
I'm happy to weigh in on this. I mean, this is a component, but I would not overly, you know, I wouldn't give undue weight to this. I mean, it is a component of, you know, when we think about how authors, you know, the sort of the networks they're in terms of, you know, where they sit in their field, where they sit among their cohort, you know, the conversations they're in. And it's kind of, you know, for first books, especially where, you know, we don't anticipate, I think some first books are from international celebrities or from people with huge social media platforms, but we don't expect that for most cases. It's a useful way for people to talk about their work and to be engaged with their work in a field separate from conferences when they exist and separate from other things, but I wouldn't give necessarily undue weight to it. So for example, if you're not on a social network, I wouldn't anticipate that the press would require you to join one for your first book, or you know, it's a useful metric to know. And for some, there are books where this makes a huge amount of difference. But for a lot of first books, it's another component, but it's not a requirement.
Thank you. There's a question that has been popping up again and again in the chat, and that I had hoped it was sort of the first one I asked, but it's been rephrased in different ways and in such ways that I want to, if we started the Q&A with that, maybe we can end it with that as well, which is the question about the range of authors that a press publishes, and how it had been initially posed as what happens with scholars who are unaffiliated with universities. But more broadly, the question is about authors who may not be in the US, or may be not academics, not affiliated with an academic institution, or persons of color, and how your presses are working to diversify and have more equity in your list of authors.
I just wrote a novel about this in the
I
chat,
saw, yeah.
But I mean, I think that is such a crucially important question. And I think my question addressed a little bit, obviously the problem of the overwhelmingly white nature of scholarly publishing, that I know my colleagues at Duke and I have been really putting a lot of effort into trying to change. I think that I tried to specifically mention, that I do make a special effort to reach out to people who I think might not necessarily have the same kinds of mentoring networks, or have access to the same kinds of resources, or may feel marginalized at their institutions. I think that's super important to understand that not everyone feels as, like I said, entitled to reach out to an editor, or as confident in the value of their own work. And I think that trying to lift up marginalized voices is one of the big responsibilities and privileges that we have as editors. Trying to advocate for scholars of color, I think, is just one of the most important responsibilities that we have. I feel really lucky to get to work with so many brilliant scholars of color, and but I'll also let Karen and Eric talk, because I have said a lot about this.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. I mean, this is clearly it is one of the most important contemporary conversations. It's something that the publishing industry, and I don't just mean university press publishing, is really wrestling with in the most fundamental way. You can see it throughout the news and in every, and in some of the ways, it's actually, I was thinking about some of the way that we are talking, and we're reorganizing internally. We're working on reaching out to areas and communities we've never reached out before. We're even watching our language. I think earlier we talked about fit for a press, and trying to be very transparent and really, and really be very clear, decode that for everybody. We've done some other things which I think are really important. If you look, presses are increasingly, it used to be hard to find editors lists in some cases. Now suddenly there's, everyone is very clear. The inboxes are, the emails are clear, what people are doing, the decision-making is getting clear. I know on our website, we're trying to do a lot more about process and presentation. So that there's no, so that it's not necessarily behind a veil. And sort of example, I think you talked about earlier, Danielle, we don't really have a slush pile anymore. We used to have if you're interested in a proposal, send it to this address, no name, no comment. Now we've really asked all our editors to engage, and we're asking everyone to be very present and transparent on how we're making decisions. So, I mean, that's just one of a whole multitude of things, but these are incredibly important conversations.
I'd just add that we're trying to see it through the whole process. So not just in the initial evaluation that I was talking about earlier, but through peer review is very important. So I think all of our presses are focusing on questions of how we can get equitable peer review. Like, how do we find who we can ask that would be appropriate, and how can we bring out voices that may not have been heard before, and how can we manage this review process better? How can we find the right peers and bring out the right voices? So there's that piece, and then of course there's what happens after your book is published, and working with you and with different groups that may be new, but we just need to get ourselves there. And, you know, I think we're all trying, I think, as a community, working on these issues. So. No, I understand the difficulty, and just encourage people to think of us as people, and just to approach us and ask for help, and think of it as a conversation and a dialogue, and hopefully we can move forward together.
Thank you all. That is really good to hear, and that change is happening. And your presses have been very important in opening up new fields, and fields that have broadened the discourse and have broadened the kinds of topics, the kinds of questions, the range of authors. So that is really important work that you do, not just in publishing scholarship of quality, but in helping new authors and new fields gain and advance the work that we do. We are at time. We knew that there would be more questions that we could answer, but we hope that this has been a useful event for everybody who attended, and that it gives you a sense of the process and also about how to get this kind of information. As I mentioned, this is the first event this semester. We do a monthly how-to. Our next one is on February 19th, how to develop a second book project. Not to move too quickly or anything, but something that a lot of junior scholars at USC have been asking for. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Eric, and Karen. It has been such a privilege to have you here, and I'm very, very grateful for your time and all your expertise. And thank you everyone for coming.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks to USC for hosting, and thanks for all of the great questions and interaction. And your wonderful moderation, Daniela. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes,
no, thank you.
Excellent work. Thank you.
And if I didn't get to your question, I'm so sorry. I really meant to. I tried.
And you now know that our emails are widely available, so you can ask one of us yourself. Have a good afternoon,
Take care, everyone.
Bye.